This is Kick-Ass Politics. I'm Ben Mathis. Kick-Ass Politics is sponsored by Fiverr. You've heard me rave about Fiverr before. That's Fiverr with two R's. Fiverr is the world's largest online marketplace for services, with over 100 categories, all offered at a fixed base price of just $5. Logo design, business consulting, marketing, business cards and stationery, web design, translation, proofreading, legal consulting, and just about any other service you can imagine, all offered at a fixed base price of just $5. And right now, if you go to kickasspolitics.com and click on the Fiverr ad on our sponsor page, you'll be showing your support for the show, and you'll get some great offers on services tailored to your needs. Whatever you need done, find it on Fiverr. And now, enjoy the show. Hi, I'm Ben Mathis, and welcome to Kick-Ass Politics. Yesterday, Forbes Magazine announced their annual list of the most powerful people in the world, and for the third year in a row, the number one most powerful person in the world is Russian President Vladimir Putin, followed by German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and then President Obama at number 3. That's kind of embarrassing. In case you're wondering, the Democrat frontrunner Hillary Clinton ranked at number 58, and Republican frontrunner Donald Trump barely squeaked onto the list at number 72. In explaining why Putin was picked as the most powerful person in the world for the third year in a row, Forbes magazine said, quote, "Russia's president continues to prove he's one of the few men in the world powerful enough to do what he wants and get away with it." And from looking at the news, that's not much of an exaggeration. There isn't a single person in Russia powerful enough to question his decisions, much less mount a remotely viable challenge to Vladimir Putin. And abroad, the international community acts just about as helpless. He helped himself to a piece of the Ukraine and all but booted the U.S. out of Syria, and the sanctions we've imposed on Russia have stung just about as much as a parking ticket. He's been described as cold, enigmatic, calculating, ruthless, and even megalomaniacal. But today, we're going to go beyond the comic book villain idea of Vladimir Putin and try to get a deeper understanding of the man who may very well be America's biggest geopolitical foe, with my guest today, Stephen Lee Myers. He's been a reporter for the New York Times for 26 years, spending 7 of those years in Russia, part of that time as Moscow bureau chief during the period when Putin consolidated his power. He's recently written the most extensive biography to date on Vladimir Putin, called The New Tsar: The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. Today we'll talk about Vladimir Putin's early life in the KGB, how he quickly rose from obscurity to become Russian prime minister in less than 4 years, his romantic life, what drives him, how he views the West, and what his end game is. With my guest today, Stephen Lee Myers, in just a moment.
Hollywood to Washington, it's time for Kick-Ass Politics. And now here's your host, Ben Mathis.
Today I'm joined by Stephen Lee Myers. He's worked as a reporter for the New York Times for 26 years, and he spent 7 of those years in Russia during the same period when Vladimir Putin consolidated his power. And now he has a brand new book out called The New Tsar: The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. Stephen, thanks for coming on the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
I think there are a lot of people who are like me who, before this book, my image of Vladimir Putin up to this point was always kind of this cartoonish Bond villain type of character. And this book really fleshes him out and paints a much broader portrait of who Vladimir Putin is and what motivates him than anything that I have seen written previously about the man. Let's talk about his early years. It's interesting that such a powerful man came from such humble beginnings. And he grew up in what you describe as abject poverty. He wasn't much of a student, didn't really show much promise for much of his early life. So tell us a little bit about the origin story of Vladimir Putin.
He grew up in a communal apartment in the center of Leningrad, as been described as quite fetid, with cracks in the stairs, and, shared a communal apartment with three other families. He didn't have a room of his own, for example. Shared
The
communal.
typical Soviet experience that that we always heard about.
It's important to think of it as a tip. It was typical.
Yeah.
He was not a child of privilege. Certainly, his father was a factory worker. His mother did odd jobs. He was an ordinary Russian child, and he grew up probably not aware of the deprivation as much. And so he grew up in this environment. He describes it himself as a pure Soviet education, the way he was brought up, and it was certainly not something that would lead you to think that this was somebody who was going to rise to the heights that he has.
Yeah, it talks about how he plagiarized his thesis paper in college, and how he was kind of a rambunctious kid in school, wasn't particularly dedicated to his studies. And then he goes into the KGB, and by all accounts seems to have a rather unremarkable career. In your book, you tell this apocryphal story about Putin when he was a lieutenant colonel for the KGB, stationed in Dresden, East Germany in the fall of 1989. Could you tell that story for me? Because I think that reveals an awful lot about who Vladimir Putin is and what his worldview is.
To back up a little bit, he joined the KGB straight out of college, and he decided he would join the KGB. And as an impressionable young teenager, he had seen a movie about a secret agent who had infiltrated the Nazi army. This movie came out when he was 16, and the day after he saw this movie, he decided he would join, and even went and tried to volunteer as a teenager at the KGB. And his career, as you point out, wasn't terrific. He didn't soar through the ranks, certainly. He spent a lot of time in Leningrad, working, he says, for the foreign intelligence branch of the KGB, not the domestic KGB that was involved in the repressions, though some have suspected that he did have a role in those as well. Very secretive kind of career. But the one part of his career that is well known was when he served in East Germany, and was there at a pivotal time, perestroika, when the protests that led to the breaching of the Berlin Wall, and then pivotedly when the protesters continued after the Berlin Wall opened up to demand change and ultimately reunification with West Germany. And he was there one night in 1989 in Dresden when the protesters overran the Stasi police headquarters. The compound was just adjacent to where the KGB had its villa, where he had spent 5 years working with the Stasi officers. He considered them colleagues and friends, allies, of course. And he was horrified to see the crowd overrun this building. At one point during the evening, and I found a witness who was there, so I was able to debunk some of the legends around this, a group of the protesters came to the KGB villa and also wanted to go through that to find what files might be there and so forth. And this was when Putin called for reinforcements. He was this deputy in the villa. It was a small outpost for the KGB, but the boss was around somewhere. He was out of town, and Putin couldn't find him, and so he was left without clear instructions of what to do. And he called the Soviet military base there and asked for reinforcements. He wanted them to send soldiers to protect the building from this mob. Very strikingly, the officer that he got on the line told him that he couldn't do anything because he had asked for instructions, but Moscow is silent. They hadn't given him instructions, and so Putin couldn't get reinforcements, at least not right away. And he did the only thing he could do, really, and he was quite conflicted about it as he talked, as he recounts the story. He went outside, and again, I met somebody who was there on the other side of the wall, and he saw this very small man come out without his hat, without a weapon, and tell them that it was a diplomatic compound of the Soviet Union, and that they shouldn't harass it. If they did, the guards would open fire. And the guy who was in the crowd described the mood. The mood was euphoric. It wasn't an angry mob, as Putin saw it. But they also realized that, this was serious business, and they were taking on the Stasi and had won that night. They didn't need to take on the KGB and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So the crowd basically went back to the other protest. And, it was a heroic moment for Putin in a way, to stand up for this, but also an incredibly embittering one because, first of all, he saw the mob taking over. But then also he felt like all of his Stasi colleagues, had been betrayed. And it infuriated him that the Moscow Center, the KGB, and the Soviet government wasn't able to do more to protect them, especially after the fall of East Germany and the reunification with the West.
Yeah, and you talk about how Putin himself uses this story as a metaphor. There's a recurring theme throughout of him wanting to bring order out of chaos, at sometimes perhaps even at all costs.
I think that he fears one thing most, and that is disorder and chaos brought on by the mob. The uprising, political upheaval, the collapse of central authority, as being the most dangerous thing for Russia. It's what caused the Soviet Union to collapse. It's what caused the Soviet influence over Eastern Europe to collapse. And he's seen it in moments of that, even under the new democratic Russia in the 1990s when it was quite weak. It faced a war in Chechnya in the mid-90s.
Right.
And when he rose into power, it was clear that his ultimate objective always was to avoid chaos and to do that by creating the stability. And the stability in his mind comes from the iron fist of the security services. He doesn't see the Soviet experience of restrictive, repressive security apparatus that the KGB was. He didn't see that as a negative. He saw it as something that was positive, loyal, patriotic intelligence officers defending the state, like the guy in the movie, that made him want to be an agent in the first place. And that instinct of his is something that you see all the way through his political career, and you see it today in Syria. It's why Russia's intervening in Syria, because they see the same thing happening to another ally, and he's going to now, because he's in a position to do it, protect them. But I think that he views the upheaval in Syria that began with protests as an extension of the protests of the Arab Spring, which toppled one autocratic government after another. And he believed that those protests were instigated by foreign influences. And he's all but said that he means the United States. And he saw this as a march to Tunisia, to Cairo, to Tripoli, to Damascus, to Moscow. If you remember the protest that greeted his re-election, those came in the wake of the Arab Spring, and he saw it all of a piece.
Well, yeah, because you talk in the book about how he uses the U.S. as a bête noire for kind of all of the woes of Russia. Anything that goes wrong, it's attributed to some sort of Western manipulation. And to some extent, this is nothing new, really. I mean, politicians have always tried to scare the citizens with the idea of the barbarians at the gate. So what you said is interesting because it doesn't sound like this is necessarily a calculated political move. It sounds like, according to you, he genuinely seems to think that Russia is under attack by the U.S. and to a larger extent by the West.
I think he does feel that, and he feels it in his heart. He believes that the democratic systems that have been set up generally, they're not just American, but in Eastern Europe, this great transition out of the Cold War from repressive socialist governments to open, more democratic, not perfect, but they're the unification of Europe in a sort of European value political system was seen as a net good after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the West. And there was a time that Russia seemed to be part of that, to be honest. In the Yeltsin years, even in the beginning of Putin's time, he talked about Russia being a European civilization. He certainly developed close economic ties with Germany and other countries in Europe. And yet, as he tightened political control at home, fearing this instability, he felt like we were insisting on imposing our vision of democracy, which wasn't his vision of democracy. And to the extent that we supported opposition groups or we supported free media, We supported civil society. That was all seen as a kind
Isn't
of
that what democracy is?
fifth column. It's true. No, that is what democracy is. And
I don't think he thinks he supports democracy, but I don't think he does.
He doesn't support democratic competition, and there are instances of this.
That's kind of
It's an important part.
Say.
They have elections still, but
Yeah.
they haven't been genuine elections since his first
Right.
one. And the one of the really telling things in his background, beyond the KGB, I think, and his 15 years there, is that he joined the Democrats of the new Russia, working for the mayor of the newly renamed St. Petersburg,
Yeah.
Anatoly Sobchak, who was one of the great democratic figures, an ally of Yeltsin's early on in Perestroika and then beyond. Putin adored this man. He considered him almost like a second father. And in 1996, he faced re-election. Sobchak had grown quite enamored with himself, is a polite way to put it, I think. And he loved his international celebrity, hosting the Goodwill Games and things like this. But he paid much less attention to actually running the city at a time in the 90s. It was a very difficult time for Russia, generally everywhere. And this other deputy promised to make the trains run. He promised to fix the sewage system and the subways and the basic services. And he won. He beat him in a fair election. And Putin considered this an ultimate betrayal, called the man a Judas, and was devastated by this loss. He was out of work, for one thing. And it was that loss that sent him to Moscow. I think that if Sobchak had won, he would have happily stayed as a deputy in Petersburg, and history would be different today.
Yeah, it's interesting because the moment that the Soviet Union starts to collapse, he gives the KGB his walking papers, and he decides to go into politics. When he went into politics working for the mayor of St. Petersburg, who you said was a big champion of democratic reform and so forth, was he suddenly just a true believer? And then he got disillusioned once he saw what democracy really is and saw the chaos that we talked about? Or was it always just a calculated career move on his behalf to leave the KGB and go into politics?
Some people will probably disagree with me on this, but I think he went with Sobchak because he did see this possibility of a, maybe not the democratic Russia in the way that we think of it, obviously, given his instincts, but of seeing the need for change. He wasn't a politician, I should make clear. He was working for the government, and so he was very much an apparatchik, bureaucrat.
Yeah, bureaucrat.
The guy who made things run. And it's how he drew Yeltsin's attention, is that when he did move to Moscow after the loss in 96, he performed tasks very efficiently without a lot of ambition. Going back to his KGB career, because ambition would get you in trouble in the 90s in Russia, because everybody seemed to want to be president and everybody was gunning for Yeltsin's job, and that made Yeltsin even more nervous and paranoid. But Putin didn't seem to want the job, and he never campaigned ever for any job he's had. But he's always performed his task well, which is a very KGB mentality as well.
It really was a meteoric rise. I mean, it's only 4 years from the time that he arrives in Moscow to him becoming prime minister of Russia.
Even less. It was 3 years. He arrives in August of 96, and in August of 99, he's appointed prime minister. And a lot of that has to do with the chaos going around in Yeltsin's Kremlin, because at the time, if you remember, he was changing prime ministers every few months. Right. He was quite sick. People talk about him being a drunk, which is certainly true, but I think he was really hampered by his health. He had a heart bypass surgery after he won his re-election, which they kept secret from the voters, and then was hampered by scandal, a scandal that was inching closer and closer to Yeltsin himself. And Putin played an instrumental role when he was the chairman, director of the Federal Security Service, the domestic successor of the KGB, in thwarting that scandal and blocking the prosecutor general's investigation by discrediting him. And that, again, drew Yeltsin's attention. And so it seemed like through a series of accidents, government shakeups, a financial crisis in '98, that Putin kept floating up. until Yeltsin looked around desperately, I think, in search of a successor, somebody who could take over and protect him personally. That he landed on Putin. And when he appointed Putin, which is interesting, is that Putin even didn't seem ready, as Yeltsin.
Really?
As Yeltsin told the story in his own memoir, that Putin said, "I'm not ready for this," and nonetheless, he also said he didn't like politics, didn't like election campaigns.
He certainly grew into the part.
He did, but by essentially changing the rules of politics and making them something that was much more suited to his demeanor, I think.
Yeah. In your book, you say that Yeltsin said of Putin, he was wary of his coolness, but he came to understand that it was just part of Vladimir Putin's nature. What was that relationship like?
As near as I could tell from people who knew both men at the time, from Yeltsin's own accounts and even Putin's, they did not have a warm relationship. Putin was not one of the inner circle by any means. He was not one of those striving for favor from the president, seeking new positions or more authority or more money. He served very quietly and loyally. And as Yeltsin described it, and the passage you just mentioned, he seemed to think that Putin was almost a detached figure. And in a way that appealed to Yeltsin, I think, because he didn't feel like Putin was ever asking him for anything, but served loyally and demonstrated that in the way that he went after the prosecutor general. Very amusing part of the history. And I think that that's what made Yeltsin have confidence that he would be as loyal as he turned out to be.
Interesting. So then he becomes prime minister and very quickly manages to consolidate power. How did he go about that?
I think that there was still an element of accident to it, because within
there does
days,
seem to be a running theme of him being at the right place at the right time throughout this story.
There's always luck involved, I suppose. But interestingly, a few days before he was appointed prime minister, there was an incursion from Chechnya into another region in southern Russia, which made it look like that they were trying to spread the independence movement, split up Russia more. Right. You can imagine how a new prime minister with Putin's temperament would view that, and Putin wanted to make sure that all of what the borders of Russia maintained or were maintained as a whole. And at the time, the prospect of another war in Chechnya was so unpopular. The other political leaders were opposed to it and said so. They said they did not want us to see the Russian army go back into Chechnya. Putin disregarded all of that. And at the risk of his own political career, he said, "I'm not going to let this happen. I'm going to crush these bandits," as he called them. And he did. He sent in force, a heavy military force. And they didn't do a limited incursion. They pushed all the way to the capital of Grozny, and then drove the rebel leadership out of the republic and into the mountains. And what surprised everybody, I think including Putin, was how popular that was.
Yeah, because prior to that, the one thing that people didn't want was war. Mm-hmm. That was the overriding priority for people. They didn't want more war. That he was able to orchestrate that and pull that off, and I don't want to say make war popular again, but
I think from all my experience there covering Chechnya, what Russians didn't want was defeat.
Ah, okay.
And what Putin gave them was victory.
Yeah.
And that's what the Russian people responded to. And with that, he tightened the control of the coverage of the war, so the media didn't have as much access to the other side, so you didn't hear the sympathetic aspirations of the Chechen people who simply want independence. That those voices were silenced. The opposition to the war was silenced. And again, people cheered. And when his popularity rating, at a time when I think you could still trust the polls there much more than you can now, soared. And that's led a lot of people to believe that, in fact, the whole thing was orchestrated to get him reelected. But that overlooks the fact that nobody thought it would be a good idea politically to do this. It was a risk that he took. And he knew it. He said he thought he would be out of office in a few months. And in fact, he became so popular that the other people who had been ready to run for president both withdrew. so that Putin was essentially left not unchallenged, but with the communists and a couple other.
Yeah. That's interesting because, I think that the stereotype or the Western image is of his rise to power is that he somehow manipulated Yeltsin into getting in as prime minister and gradually coerced the oligarchs and created this cocoon of power around him that protected him so that he was almost unimpeachable.
I agree with the last part of that,
Okay.
but I don't believe, as some do, that it was all somehow a conspiracy or contrived. That somebody was thinking this through. I think it was a series of accidents that led Yeltsin to Putin, and that Putin himself didn't anticipate it. Some people want to claim that they brought him to power. Different oligarchs said, they were the decisive factor, but I don't believe that's true. When he came to power, he turned to the people that he trusted most, and that those were people from his KGB background. They were security guys, also people from Leningrad, from Petersburg, and so he did consolidate power very quickly. He did very quickly rein in the oligarchs, almost from day one. After he was inaugurated president, he didn't move while acting president. He waited until his election, but then he moved against media oligarchs. He moved against the oil oligarchs, and slowly over time consolidated power. And when I first arrived there, he didn't have the kind of uncontested control that he would have. There was still a parliament with opposition parties in it. There were still free media. There was still debate. There was still legislation that was being debated and voted for and against. But slowly over time, he intensified the Kremlin control, so that by the time that the new parliament was reelected in 2003, and then he was reelected in 2004, he was almost uncontested.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and then I'll be back for more with Stephen Lee Myers on Vladimir Putin. Stay tuned. If you're enjoying my conversation with Stephen Lee Myers, then check out his book, The New Tsar: The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. And right now, you can download the audio version of this book for free with a special promotion for our listeners from audible.com. Just go to audibletrial.com/kickasspolitics for a free 30-day trial and a free audiobook download, which can be The Last Tsar by my guest today, Stephen Lee Myers, or any of Audible's 180,000 titles for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, iPad, or MP3 player. That's audibletrial.com/kickasspolitics. Or click on the sponsor link on our webpage to download the free audiobook of your choice. And if you like Kick-Ass Politics and want to help keep us on the air, then please support the show by making a donation to our GoFundMe campaign at gofundme.com/kickasspolitics. Or go to the show website and click on the donate link. Your support will help keep us producing new and interesting programs in the future. That's gofundme.com/kickasspolitics. And now back to more with my guest today, Stephen Lee Myers. We're back, and I'm talking with Stephen Lee Myers, the author of The New Tsar: The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. Moving ahead to 2008, he decides not to run for president, and instead he runs for prime minister and installs his right-hand man, Dmitry Medvedev, as his successor as president. How did he pull that off?
Beginning around the day after his reelection the first time, there was already speculation and concern. What would happen when his 2 terms ended? The Russian Constitution has a term limit in it for 2 presidential terms consecutive. It doesn't talk about anything beyond that. But for years leading up to 2008, there was a kind of paralysis in the system because Putin was so popular, he had so consolidated control that it was becoming difficult for people to imagine him not being in power. He had tamed the oligarchs, he had tamed the opposition parties so that they're now effectively loyal opposition. And he had so consolidated political control inside the Kremlin that the real competition that was going on was inside his inner circle. of like who would be groomed, who would get appointed the way he had been appointed by Yeltsin. And they called this, and I call it one of the chapters, the 2008 problem. And only in an authoritarian system is it a problem to have a re-election. And there were appeals to Putin literally up until the end of the election to change the Constitution, simply remove the term limit on the president. And with the snap of his fingers, he would have been able to do that. But he did not want to, which is very interesting about him, I think. And again, going back to what you're saying, you see him as a villain and as a caricature, and there are truly elements of that. But there is also a more complex story behind some of the things he's done. And he did not want to be seen as a tin pot dictator, you know, a Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, you know, who has erased all limits, you know, president for life, this sort of thing. So he wanted to manage the secession, but also not violate the spirit, at least, of the Constitution, or maybe the letter. And he did that by grooming two of his closest allies, one, Sergei Ivanov, who served with him in the KGB from the very beginning, and Dmitry Medvedev, who was a younger version of Putin, if you will, had also worked for Sobchak in Petersburg, a younger guy, a lawyer, also very close to Putin. And ultimately, Putin decided on Medvedev. And that decision decided the election. It's like a primary of one. You know, so Medvedev took over, and Putin then was appointed prime minister by Medvedev, which seemed to kind of mollify everyone in the political elite. So in other words, Putin wasn't leaving after all. People were terrified that he would leave. But he did hand the reins of the state over to Medvedev to a degree. I mean, I don't think anybody thought he wasn't the paramount ruler and had a veto over any major decision. But he did give the powers of the presidency, especially the role of the head of the state, you know, foreign policy, he left to Medvedev to a certain degree.
So the U.S. was dealing with Medvedev, not with Putin, because in the press, I mean, I think everyone in America remembers when Obama was running for re-election, that famous situation where he was talking to Medvedev, and he says, "Tell Vladimir," something along the lines of, "We'll have more room to negotiate after the election."
Exactly. So, and he said, "I'll tell Vladimir." Yes. And there's no question that Putin remained the paramount leader. I mean, there's no doubt about that in my mind. But I've talked a lot to the Obama administration people who were involved in this. And, you know, when they came to office, Obama, that is, in January of 2009, Medvedev was already the president of Russia at that point. Bush had some dealings with him at the end of his presidency. But they made a deliberate choice to respect the office of the presidency in Russia, and through protocol and all that, you know, dealt with him directly, trying as they could to make sure they touched base with Putin. And Putin would deflect. He would actually send them back to Medvedev on issues. If they were trying to deal with Iran issue back then as well, and Putin always said, talk to the president. And, you know, one of the WikiLeaks cables, one of the American diplomats described Medvedev as being the Robin to Putin's Batman. And so I think that everybody was aware of that. But tellingly, when the Arab Spring began, Medvedev was surprised by a question at Davos, the annual gathering, when somebody asked about the uprising in Tunisia, which was happening at that point. And he expressed sympathy for the aspirations of the people in the street in a way that was quite alarming to Putin. And then he went on as president under enormous pressure from the White House, including a visit by Joe Biden to Moscow, to not interfere, not veto the intervention in Libya at the UN. And under that pressure, Medvedev agreed. And abstained from the vote, so that the NATO operation in Libya went ahead, and Putin was infuriated by this. And it was their first public breach. And from that moment on, Medvedev was doomed. And it was a few months later that Putin came back and announced, and I've been told by people close to Putin that it was that decision, that his handling of Libya, which he saw as irresolute, that prompted Putin to feel like he had to come back and take the reins again.
But it wasn't the plan always probably for him to come back after only 4 years?
Many people have said that. I mean, in hindsight, it looked like, of course, he was always going to come back. And Putin even said something that infuriated the protesters who did pour into the streets. This was a very unpopular decision, at least in some quarters. He said, we've discussed this for years. But I know from people close to both men that they hadn't discussed it. There hadn't been an agreement. So if Putin knew all along he would come back whenever he wanted to, which is probably what he felt, I think the evidence supports that. At least Medvedev thought he had a chance to be president for another 4 years.
Yeah, because toward the end, there were reports of kind of some tension between the two of them. And was Medvedev going to go rogue and decide to run again or not? But did he really ever have a shot?
That was wishful thinking on part of his supporters. But, the fact is that Medvedev represents a camp within the Putin circle. And it is, it's easy to generalize, but it is more liberal. It is more open to the West. It's less dominated by the security mindset. And I think and that's why there was some progress made between the U.S. and Russia during his presidency. I think people were very hopeful that Putin would slowly create a political system that would allow turnover. And him coming back, a quiet change they made in the Constitution that extended the presidential terms, didn't remove the term limits, but made the terms 6 years, meant that when he came back, he can be president now for another 2 terms under the Constitution without breaking it, and serve 12 years.
Well, I mean, for a guy like that, is there any chance that he's going to go away quietly? I mean, if you built your base of power around corruption in a society where everyone is corrupt, and if you tick off the wrong guy, the next thing you know, you end up in jail, just like many of Putin's enemies did. So if he ever were to leave power, how does he have any assurance that he won't end up in prison the very next day?
We haven't talked a lot about corruption, but you're absolutely right that the system is rife with it. It's an instrumental part of the Putin era, how deeply rooted the corruption has become, and how he's built entire industries around his friends. I mean, people close to him who have emerged from also this humble background that he did in Petersburg, and now control billions of dollars in various projects, various state enterprises. And, they've enriched themselves in such a way that so many people in the system are now dependent on Putin. And the problem, I think, and it's a problem of his own making, is that it's impossible now for anybody to imagine him still not being in power. So how does he ensure a transition if he's even interested in one? And friends of his have told me that he doesn't want to be president for life. So maybe like Yeltsin, he's going to lurch around in an increasingly weakened state, looking for a successor who will guarantee his personal safety after he leaves office.
How do you retire with any kind of security that the people who protected you and kept you in power are still going to protect you?
It's interesting that one of the things that he did early on, and he was criticized for this, is when Yeltsin stepped down, one of his first decrees was to lay out the privileges of a former president in Russia. So he could live in the state property where he had lived. He got certain bodyguards. He got immunity from prosecution for any of the acts of office, which was part of how they were able to protect him legally. And those would, in theory, extend to Putin as well, were he willing to step down at some point.
Well, he has a lot more than that from what a lot of people speculate. There are these stories of this gigantic palace that's being built on the Black Sea. There are people who think that he may very well be the richest man in Europe. What's your best guess at his wealth?
I know I've been told, I should say, that the CIA has done an estimate of his wealth that put it at one point a few years ago at anywhere from $40 to $70 billion. But I think it's actually more telling to think about it less as a big pot of gold somewhere. It's a much more informal system of ownership or control that he has over assets. That could be assets, stocks in major companies, for example, owned by family members. This is a new tradition in Russia today that people like Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, are exposing. the very expensive apartments of wives of deputy ministers and so forth. So I think that there's a lot of hidden wealth in that respect. But I don't think Putin needs to have money, a bank card.
Right.
But because he can call in money when he needs it. I mean, you saw that in the development in Sochi. Spent $51 billion. They have spruced up residences that belong to him. Maybe he will inherit the place that he lives outside of Moscow when he does leave office. But I don't think that it's a cache of money somewhere.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. You brought up the Sochi Olympics, and you talk about the Sochi Olympics and the annexation of Crimea as sort of a crowning achievement for Putin. For those of us in the West, it was an interesting juxtaposition of, he had all this goodwill that he built up with the Olympics. They spent all this money to do that, and he was telling people to smile to the tourists. And, it was this huge PR coup for Russia. And then just weeks later, he invades Crimea. And it seemed to me, what was the point, building up all that goodwill with the Olympics only to just squander it weeks later on this power grab?
It's hard to get into the guy's head, but if you look at the events as they happened, the protests in Ukraine started the previous fall, in October, November, when the president there, Yanukovych, abandoned this deal that was years in the works to have a trade agreement with the European Union. But this was something that really alarmed Putin, as we've talked about. So it was something that was boiling along even as the Olympics approached. And he had, it seemed, right before the Olympics in December, had bought off Yanukovych with $15 billion in loans. And it seemed to have kind of deflated the protest there that had been going on for some time. And then the Olympics began in late January into February. And there seemed to be, as you said, this kind of goodwill that had been created. A lot of people thought that the Olympics wouldn't happen. I mean, they thought there'd be a terrorist attack. They thought that venues wouldn't be ready, and some were ready really only at the last minute. There was fresh paint on a lot of the structures in Sochi. But nonetheless, the opening ceremony, the games, as they should, seemed to be apolitical, and it did put a good face forward for Russia, I think. And if you remember, it was during the games that the protests in Ukraine heated up again, they got more radicalized, or at least more temperamental. Unfortunately, they turned to violence. And there was a 2-day period during the Olympics when 100 people were killed in the center of Kiev in shooting in both directions. And there's still disputes now over who started the shooting and who suffered the most from it. But nonetheless, in the middle of this crowning achievement, this horrible event happens next door, not far away from Sochi, really. Yeah. And I think Putin was infuriated by it. He was also
he was not, in his mind at least, the instigator of all that.
No, in his mind, what happened was a coup. Putin saw this happening, again, I think reacted personally, that, his crowning moment was being sullied by this horrible, intervention from the outside, meaning the West, meaning the U.S. And he reacted in a very emotional and impetuous way by annexing Crimea. No one saw that coming, because I think it was a decision made in a very small group of people and completely out of an emotional response. I mean, he honeymooned in Crimea. Right. This is a place that's special to him, and it's a beautiful place. And because of the Black Sea Fleet, it was always a very emotional issue in security circles. And I think he just saw the opportunity of there's chaos in Kiev, and the Black Sea Fleet is threatened, and therefore I'm going to make sure that nothing happens to it.
But before I read this book, like I said, I kind of, like a lot of people, I think I saw him as a Bond villain. And I used to tell people I thought he was probably the most dangerous man in the world. How dangerous do you think Vladimir Putin is?
That's an excellent question. And it's hard to answer because there was a time I would have thought that Russia was too weak to be a danger. And I think that the miscalculation many people in the West made was that Russia as a weak country was a better thing for security. And Putin obviously doesn't see it that way. Yeah. And he's intervening in Syria right now, I think, because he can. He can because they've put some effort into military modernization since the war in Georgia in 2008, and that's paying off in some respects. But since the events in Crimea, you've seen a big uptick in these exercises, including with the strategic forces, confrontations in the air and at sea. And those are dangerous. That's like the Cold War again.
Yeah.
I think if you look at the intervention in Syria, it's been much more decisive in its tactics and strategy, I think, than the American-led coalition has been against ISIS, which some people give him credit for. But it's also worth keeping in mind that Russia's committed 36 planes, and the American-led coalition has more than 300. So, in terms of scale, I don't think Russia poses an immediate threat. But people in Eastern Europe, especially our NATO allies, are quite worried about this.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Is that the line that he won't cross, stepping onto a NATO ally's sovereign territory? Would that be the line for him?
I would hope so. The reaction of NATO and the United States since Crimea has been to step up their own exercises, the rotation of forces through Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states. We sort of had an informal understanding that we wouldn't put a lot of American troops in the Baltic states. But that's changed now. And in a way, Putin has done more to unify NATO on the threat from Russia than anything else. And, we recently saw this summer the administration sending American armored equipment there, basing it forward even without the soldiers prepositioning, they call it. And I think you'll see more and more of that kind of activity, so that it is a very clear red line.
What's he up to in the Arctic these days?
You've seen in the Arctic, like in other parts of Russia, a much more intensified military posture. Some of that, and I was just up in the Arctic in July, in the Russian Arctic, and some of that is a reaction to what is an increased amount of development up there and activity because of global warming, so that there are more ships up there, there's more drilling offshore for oil and gas. And Putin has also, and this alarms people, pledged and begun to deploy much more aggressive offensive military capability up there, positioning brigades up there, air defenses. You're seeing now deployments, reopening Soviet bases along the top of Russia in the Arctic. And some people in our military are looking at this warily, and certainly Norway and the other Arctic nations are worried about how aggressive it will be. It's too soon to say, but with the operations in Syria, with the war in Ukraine, I think the limited resources, may slow down some of that military development up there, because they just can't afford to do everything. But it's very much central to Putin's vision of Russian security, the Arctic.
Well, before we go, personal life. Does he have a girlfriend?
He said not long ago that he had love in his life, but that's a kind of classic deflection. I mean, he's not saying yes or no. I mean,
there was the gymnast supposedly, and all. There are always these rumors about.
There have been rumors of other women involved. His relationship with his wife Ludmila seems to have not been particularly warm. By his second term, when he was prime minister, she had largely disappeared from life. His kids had grown and lived under secret identities, by the way. He hid them from public view, maybe with some reason, because of the war in Chechnya, fear of terrorism. That's what one of his friends told me, that it was about that. But they also have not yet reemerged, though one of the daughters seems to be under an assumed name in charge of a big program.
Was there any truth to the rumors that he had pretty much exiled her to a convent like the old czars used to do to their wives?
That was one of those things that goes in the category of legend, I think, and the caricature. It's sort of easy to say that, you know. But the fact of the matter is that they did come out and announce that they had divorced, and that it was amicable, and that a year later it was official. which was in 2013. And so since then, he's been a bachelor again. But it's not ever been demonstrated that he has yet, emerged with a second family. It's been reported. There's a false report in 2008.
And a baby, yeah.
There are reports of babies and so
Yeah.
forth, but I don't give those much credence.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. The book is called The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. Stephen Lee Myers, thank you very much for joining me to talk about Vladimir Putin.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Stephen Lee Myers for sitting down with me. If you found our conversation interesting, then you should definitely read his new book, The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. So I'm going to include an Amazon link where you can order the book in the show notes and on our website at kickasspolitics.com. And if you prefer to listen to the audio version of Stephen's book, you can download that for free thanks to that special offer for our listeners from audible.com. Just go to audibletrial.com/kickasspolitics. And you can get a free 30-day trial and a free download of The New Tsar by Stephen Lee Myers or any of over 180,000 titles. Be sure to subscribe to the show on iTunes and leave us a review. The other thing you can do to help the show is to go on your Facebook page or Twitter to recommend Kick-Ass Politics to your friends and suggest that they subscribe. And if you do that, each week you'll be entered to win a signed copy of a book by one of my guests on the show. So be sure to tag us when you do so. You can tag us on Twitter at @KAPolitics, or our Facebook page is just Kick-Ass Politics. And as always, I welcome your comments, questions, gripes, and suggestions at comments@kickasspolitics.com. But for now, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kick-Ass Politics. This podcast may not be reproduced without express written permission. Kick-Ass Politics is a trademark of Mathis Entertainment, Inc.